bone and sickle, bleeding saints and forest witches, the past unburied, the books unsealed, the old celebration returning.
Hello, and welcome to my study. Please come in and have a seat. All the books surrounding you are those used to research our show, and the individual to my right here, along with managing domestic duties, serves as our reader for any passages that will be directly quoted from these sources. Her name is Mrs. Carswell.
Hello.
Well, it's been quite a week here. We almost didn't get the show out.
We had visitors.
And as if that weren't bad enough, we're dealing with that thumping in the basement again. I thought it had gone away this winter, but it's back.
You never really thought it was the pipes.
No, I don't know. I really didn't think it would come to this.
Mr. Ridenauer invited a ghost hunting group to investigate.
A parapsychology group. They investigate unusual phenomena. We don't have ghosts. We don't need ghost hunters.
I think you scared them a little.
Maybe. I thought Dr. Bartush would be coming with them, but apparently he only consults with them, and he's not even local.
What's so special about him?
Oh, he takes a very rigorous approach to these things. This was a bait and switch. And they were all teenagers.
They were college students.
And the matching T-shirts.
I couldn't figure out what that design was.
No, and they kept handling things, touching things.
You told them they could.
Not everyone, just the psychic.
She was very theatrical, but she got fingerprints all over the clock.
Psychometry. She was supposed to be doing psychometry with the clock, touching it. And what about the dog? Who ever heard of bringing a dog on a consultation? Is that in any way professional?
When you sent the dog out, I took them over to the apiary, but he was scared of them.
The dog or the person?
Both, kind of. I think he made the dog scared. It was like he'd never seen a bee before.
I just don't understand bringing the dog.
You know what he asked me?
What?
Do they sting? He wanted to know if they sting. They're bees.
Yes, they are. Anyway, I think we should do the Patreon thank yous.
Okay.
Thank you to our friends who listen to the show.
Sharing in our travels through tales of long ago.
Stories full of folklore.
Stories full of horror.
If you give us money, we will like you more.
And our heroes of the day are...
Zardoz, 1974. Octavia Ice. And Matilda Stick.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Anyway, they're not coming back.
The ghost hunters.
The parapsychology group. I'm finding another way to get in touch with Dr. Bartush.
You know, they wanted to stay overnight and live stream their investigation. They have a YouTube or a Tickety Talk or something.
Oh, my God. Anyway, this is episode 139, The Sin Eater.
Long ago, there was a legend. When a person died, someone could free them from their sins. That was the Sin Eater.
Drayton himself was a sin eater.
You will eat a meal off my dead body, I'll give you everything.
Look upon the Sin
This
Eater.
house, my money, it will all be yours.
I take on all sins you carry, and I pawn my own soul.
The Sin Eater.
The Sin Eater was a figure associated with funerals of the 17th through 19th century, mostly in Wales and the English counties along the Welsh border. Exceptions to the rule are an account from Scotland and, more dubiously, suggestions that sin eating was practiced in America among the immigrants to the colonies. An 1870 edition of Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable defines the practice.
Poor people hired at funerals in olden days to eat beside the corpse and to take upon themselves the sins of the deceased, that the soul might be delivered from purgatory. In the Welsh country of Carmarthenshire, the sin-eater used to rest a plate of salt on the breast of the deceased and place a piece of bread on the salt. After saying an incantation over the bread, the sin-eater consumed it, and with it the sins of the dead.
Now, while sin eaters may save a soul, they certainly can't save a film. In our opening, you heard snippets from the 2022 embarrassment, Sin Eater, which presents some sort of a modern American cult preserving the tradition. It earned a grand total of 18% approval on Rotten Tomatoes, which is better than 2024's Curse of the Sin Eater, also set in contemporary America. It didn't even earn a rating. And there was also a trailer tag from 2007's The Last Sin Eater, which did the best of the lot with 22%, perhaps because it bothered to recreate a 19th century setting, albeit on the American frontier. Dreadful films, perhaps, but there is some fascinating history, so we'll just dive right in. Our earliest historical account dates to 1686 and is by the English writer on history, archaeology, and the natural sciences, John Aubrey. It's in his book, The Remains of Gentilism and Judaism, which, in less archaic language, it means something like surviving lore of the Gentiles and Jews. More specifically, it's a compilation of what we would now call folklore, a compendium of old customs, stories, rhymes, and superstitions. For centuries, Aubrey's text existed as a scarcely read manuscript in the British Library, but was finally published by the Folklore Society in 1881, shortly after the group's founding. Aubrey writes,
In the county of Hereford was an old custom at funerals to hire poor people who were to take upon them all the sins of the party deceased. One of them, I remember, lived in a cottage on Ross Highway. He was a long, lean, ugly, lamentable poor rascal. The manner was that when the corpse was brought out of the house and laid on the bier, a loaf of bread was brought out and delivered to the sin-eater over the corpse, as also a bowl of beer, which he was to drink up, and 6 pence in the money, given in consideration whereof he took upon him all the sins of the defunct, and freed him or her from walking after they were dead.
So, without this ceremony, the deceased would have been barred from heaven, condemned to wander as a ghost or undead creature. It's significant in the text that the food and drink must be handed over the corpse, though in later accounts it's sometimes left atop the body. Aubrey then goes on to mention a woman in another town who demanded this post-mortem ceremony in her will, and had set aside a special bowl for the beer, and that the local
minister could not hinder the performing of this ancient custom.
One, which Aubrey admits is
rarely used nowadays,
though was previously
used all over Wales.
The only other detail Aubrey provides is that in northern Wales, milk was substituted for beer. The next account comes from 1715. It's a letter by the bookseller and antiquarian John Bagford, published in the work of another antiquarian, John Leland, in his 1776 compendium, Collectanea. The account uses a couple terms probably requiring clarification. That is a cricket, meaning a low stool, and a groat, a coin worth about $5.
Within the memory of our fathers in Shropshire, in those villages adjoining to Wales, When a person died, there was a notice given to the old sire, for so they called him, who presently repaired to the place where the deceased lay, and stood before the door of the house, when some of the family came out and furnished him with a cricket on which he sat down facing the door. Then gave him a groat, which he put in his pocket, a crust of bread which he ate, and a full bowl of ale, which he drank off at a draught. After this he got up from the cricket and pronounced, with a composed gesture, the ease and rest of the soul departed, for which he would pawn his own soul.
Bagford's phrasing, ease and rest, and reference to pawning one's soul are echoed in later accounts. The next text comes from 1838, from the travelogue Hill and Valley, or Hours in England and Wales, by the Scottish novelist and author of children's books, Catherine Sinclair. Calling the archaic custom
popish,
she associates it with Monmouthshire in eastern Wales and with the bordering counties of England, writing,
many funerals were attended by a professed sin-eater, hired to take upon him the sins of the deceased. By swallowing bread and beer with a suitable ceremony before the corpse, he was supposed to free it from every penalty for past offences, appropriating the punishment to himself.
Rather than adding new details, Sinclair's account essentially just keeps the story in circulation. Significantly, it's also rendered in the past tense, rather than purporting to describe a current usage. And now you might be surprised to learn that there is only one more historical source describing this tradition. It's from 1852 and appears in notes from a meeting of the Cambrian, that is Welsh, Archaeological Association. It was contributed by Matthew Moggridge, an antiquary of Swansea, and describes a custom from the town of Llandybia, a bit to the north. It is also presented in the past tense as a tradition that
survived to within a recent period.
Moggridge writes,
when a person died, the friends sent for the sin-eater of the district, who, on his arrival, placed a plate of salt on the breast of the defunct, and upon the salt a piece of bread. He then muttered an incantation over the bread, which he finally ate, thereby eating up all the sins of the deceased. This done, he received his fee of 1/2 crown and vanished as quickly as possible from the general gaze, for, as it was believed, that he really appropriated to his own use the sins of all those over whom he performed the above ceremony. He was utterly detested in the neighborhood, regarded as a mere pariah, as one irredeemably lost.
The new elements here are the inclusion of salt, which doesn't appear to be eaten, the exclusion of anything to be drunk, the placement of what's consumed atop the corpse, and the contribution of these items by the sin-eater himself, rather than the bereaved family. It's also the first to describe the sin-eater not only as absorbing the sin, but as being outwardly despised by the community. From previous accounts, we might have inferred this, but could equally well have imagined him as an object of pity. In 1879, there appears a suspiciously similar account, surprisingly relocated to Scotland. It's in James Napier's Folklore, or Superstitious Beliefs in the West of Scotland within this century. It differs only in having the sin-eater provide separate plates for salt and bread, and in this case, consuming both. It's also presented as a practice recently extinct. And then in 1881, another variation of the Moggridge account appears in the volume Christmas Evans, the Preacher of Wild Wales by Reverend Paxton Hood. More convincingly, back in Wales this time, the recently vanished custom is essentially the same salt and bread routine with added emphasis on the sin eater's pariah status. As he departs,
all the friends and relatives of the departed aid his exit with blows and kicks.
The next in our chronological survey of accounts by folklorists and antiquarians was printed in the London Journal Academy in 1876, contributed by an E. M. Morris. However, the original source, which Morris serves up verbatim, appears in the 1836 volume, The Mountain Decameron by Joseph Downes. Borrowing an idea from Boccaccio's 14th century collection of travelers' tales, Downes offers a series of stories told to an English visitor to Wales over the course of 10 days. So, rather than a straightforward folklore collection, it's more of a fictionalized travelogue. On the 8th day, the narrator hears a story called The Last Sin Eater of Wales. Morris seems unaware that his contribution to Academy comes from the Mountain Decameron, as Downes' story was also recycled, again verbatim, in Thomas Roscoe's 1876 fictionalized travel journal, Wanderings and Excursions in South Wales, which Morris must have believed to be the original source. In this context, it appears as a local story related directly to the author. In a subsequent letter to the journal, a reader alerted Morris to the fact that his Sin Eater narrative was much more a work of literary fantasy than any local history. Regardless, it's a good atmospheric tale worth relating. It presents readers with a traveler riding at night through a Cardiganshire peat bog. He gets himself lost despite being
cautioned to ride far round this pitchy morass, for no horse ever ventured among the peat pits. In truth, its look was enough under a black evening to keep me off, even without peril of being swallowed, man and horse. The large moon looking red as blood, in a foul fog stagnating all over it, took leave of it, and its brown grew browner, and that browner black, till the last to be seen was one horrid blackness, where nothing lived, and nothing was heard but the low roar of the sea, washing it on two sides like the hum of some great city. More than once, I thought, a light glimmered in the very midst, but I took it for a jack-o'-lantern, if not something worse.
Jack-o'-lantern here meaning will-o'-the-wisp, or a malevolent marsh spirit that misleads travelers with its supernatural luminance. And eventually, the traveler comes upon
a house on a high point and turn of road overlooking all those many acres of hollow ground. Just as I came up hoping for lodging, I heard sounds of wailing within, and soon a woman came out into the dead of night, late as it was, and cried a name to the top pitch of her wild voice that seemed one I had heard weeping indoors. When I looked in, there lay the corpse of a man, with a plate of salt holding a bit of bread placed on its breast. The woman was shouting to the Sin Eater to come and do his office.
A version of the ritual is glimpsed somewhat through a window, and later the traveler learns that the Sin Eater makes his home along the coast, near a point perilous to ships.
In a hovel made of sea wreck and nails of such, between sea marsh and that dim bog, where the few could approach by day, none dared by night, whether for the footing or the great fear, or at least awe, which all felt of that recluse.
Appearing in 1836, the Mountain Decameron was a particularly early example of literary sin-eating, but fascination with the topic surged around the turn of the century with the 1892 publication of an article by E. Sidney Hartland in the journal Folklore, the publication of the British Folklore Society. Alongside John Aubrey's 17th century account, Hartland presented those of Bagford and Moggridge, as well as a great deal of material not specifically qualifying as sin-eating. One is the Scottish custom practiced during wakes, the disaloof, a sort of folk blessing performed over the corpse, which happens to involve a bowl of salt placed upon the chest of the deceased, though nothing is eaten and the removal of sins isn't mentioned. He also mentions a plate of snuff, likewise placed on the chest of the corpse at Irish wakes, something that all in attendance are expected to sample, though again, nothing to do with the eradication of sin. And Hartland reports that
in South Wales, a plate of salt is still often laid on the breast of the corpse, a custom once common in a much wider area. And in a parish near Chepstow, it was usual to make the figure of a cross on the salt, and cutting an apple or an orange into quarters, to put one piece at each termination of the lines, while in Pembrokeshire, a lighted candle was stuck in the salt.
Another mysterious custom, all the more mysterious for having nothing to do with the removal or particularly the eating of sins. Hartland goes even further afield with references to a Romani custom involving food placed next to the corpse, later eaten as a funeral feast, and of Bavarians setting out dough to rise on top of a corpse, and then eating cakes baked from the dough. This in order to consume the
virtues and advantages of the departed.
A tradition I don't find mentioned anywhere else. And then it's off to Kashmir and Turkestan for other geographically and culturally unrelated analogies. Now, if you know anything about Bone and Sickle, you know we're not afraid to disappoint, which may be the case here with sin eaters. As you've probably noted, the evidence for their existence seems rather scanty, though their reality can't be entirely ruled out. Obviously, it would all be more plausible should an account by a contemporary eyewitness exist, rather than the second-hand reports of incidents in the ever-receding past, always recently ended, but within the memory of previous generations, as they say. Even back in 1686, Aubrey said the custom was
observed rarely in our days.
While distance makes it hard to evaluate Aubrey's account or that of Bagford from 1715, the more recent report offered by Moggridge in 1852 was said to have occurred
within a recent period
and was pinned to a precise location, the Welsh town of Llandybia. Unfortunately, this opened his narrative to criticism. Welsh scholars balked at the fact that no Welsh language term for the practice was offered, and suggested that while a ritual involving salt or bread may have occurred, it would not have been identified as sin eating in the native tongue, and that it may have served a different purpose, something we'll pursue shortly. And in an 1883 issue of the Welsh Culture Journal, Red Dragon, scholar Reverend Sylvan Evans wrote,
I have not been indifferent as to the customs and legends of the land of my birth, and my profession often brings me into contact with funerals, but I have never found any trace of such a custom, and I have but little hesitation in saying that it is altogether unknown in the Principality.
Worse still, a schoolteacher from the same town mentioned by Moggridge wrote,
I lived there for many years. I knew all the parishioners and the history of the parish, its legends, customs, and traditions. And during the time I was there, I attended many funerals. But I'd never heard of a sin eater. I knew almost every parish in South Wales. I collected all the legends and made notes of the old customs for the late Sir Thomas Phillips. If such a custom had prevailed, I should have heard of it. I have no hesitation in writing that it is a glaring untruth.
Likewise, a congregational minister voiced his skepticism in an 1882 edition of the periodical Christian World, surprised by the reference to sin eating in Reverend Paxton Hood's 1881 Christmas Evans, the Preacher of Wild Wales, an account, if you'll recall, which was seemingly derived from Moggridge. The minister complained that
some octogenarians whom I have questioned have never seen a sin-eater. Neither have they heard their parents nor their grandparents refer to this custom.
But what did all these Welshmen know? Sin eating was far too interesting to be so easily set aside. The period from the 1890s into the first decade of the 20th century saw the publication of a rash of literary works incorporating the character of the sin eater, and it wasn't just Hartland's 1892 article in Folklore that spurred this. In 1893, Irish writer William Butler Yeats's publication of The Celtic Twilight, a collection of folklore and folklore-inspired tales, set in motion a broader literary movement, the Irish literary revival, part of a general Celtic revival, which an interest in Welsh culture and language was part. More broadly, all this coincided with rising British interest in folklore, spurred by the appearance of James Fraser's The Golden Bough, published in 1890 in 2 volumes, and then in 1900 just 3, and then between 1906 and 1915 in a full 12-volume set. But back to the Sin Eaters. The first literary treatment during this period was the 1895 novel The Sin Eater by William Sharp, writing under the pseudonym Fiona MacLeod. It's the story of a destitute young man born a bastard who holds a grudge against the man who failed to marry his mother. When he takes up sin eating as a last-ditch effort to support himself, he learns a secret bit of folklore, created for the novel, by which the sin eater can create a demon, one that he hopes to send against his biological father. Not a good idea, it turns out. Then, in 1905, there was Hearts of Wales by Alan Raine, which displaces the sin-eating tradition back to the 15th century. Its sin-eater takes up the practice as a means of doing penance for his betrayal of the Lord under whom he served. It's supposed to relate to the Welsh betraying their own nationalistic cause. And in 1910, Henry Elwin Thomas published The Forerunner, featuring a sin-eater who begins his sin-eating to atone for the sins of a famous highwayman who is his father. 1920 saw the publication of The Sin Eater, a Welsh legend, a long rhymed narrative describing a greedy and monstrous sin eater called Black Evan, also known as the human spider, who lives in a marsh. And eventually, after meeting his judgment, he's found dead and
scorched as if with heaven's bolt.
I drink to the peace of him that's gone.
Is there a sin eater?
I'll do it.
Oh, Gideon. No.
You're hearing a snippet from a rather good 1989 BBC adaptation of Mary Webb's 1924 novel, Precious Bane. Set in rural Shropshire, an English county on the Welsh border, the novel follows Prue Sarn, a young woman who believes herself cursed because she was born with a cleft lip. Webb presents a single but pivotal incident of sin eating, casually engaged in by Prue's non-believing brother, who uses it to ensure his inheritance of the family farm. It doesn't go well for him, but then it hardly goes well for anyone in the novel, with the possible exception of Prue, who finds a sort of bittersweet destiny. By the way, we'll be presenting the sin-eating chapter of Precious Bane as our bonus episode this month, if you're interested in hearing that. And the last example is Christina Braun's short story, The Sins of the Fathers, published in 1939 and later anthologized in horror collections of the 1960s. Its rather neatly constructed tale of multiple deceptions and turnabouts was dramatized in a same-name 1972 episode of Rod Serling's Night Gallery,
Welcome, art lovers.
providing wider American audiences with an introduction to this concept of sin eating.
night gallery.
All these creative reinterpretations of the Sin Eaters seem to have muddied the waters a bit, and after World War II, a couple new accounts surfaced, ones which broke with the traditional narratives. In a 1958 article in Folklore, folklorist Enid Porter reported on a female rather than male Sin Eater. It's unclear when the incident was supposed to have occurred, but the source relating the story was a school teacher in the town of Little Ouse who recorded the account sometime before her death in 1906. Whether intentional or not, the Sin Eater she describes was said to have
taken a large dose of poppy tea that rendered her unconscious. Neighbors sent for the minister, who on seeing her said it seemed she would not recover. He read the prayers for the dying and gave her absolution. Soon after his departure, the woman sat up and gradually recovered. She was then assured by her friends that as she was now free from her own sins by virtue of the absolution, she was now free to take on those of others.
Another figure often mentioned in histories of sin eating is Richard Munslow, who died in 1906 and, like many before him, was given the title the last of the Sin Eaters, albeit at a slightly later date than most. There aren't any details specific to his alleged practice of sin eating, but it is known that he was a wealthy farmer employing 3 laborers working 70 or 75 acres of land. His prosperity makes him highly atypical of the poor wretches traditionally recruited as sin eaters. Since he wouldn't have pursued sin eating for financial gain, it's been suggested that he did so due to the loss of his children to scarlet fever, 3 within a single week. Well, this might impart a special empathy towards those losing loved ones. A concern with the burden of unforgiven sin doesn't seem particularly relevant with the deaths of young children, but who knows? There also appears to be no mention of Munslow's sin eating before the 1970s, when it appears in a pamphlet promoting Shropshire lore and history. Munslow's legendary vocation seems to have been particularly associated with his grave in the town of Ratship, presumably as a spooky legend inspiring midnight visits by daring teens. His place in the cemetery was of such interest that in 2010, town stonemasons dedicated money for the restoration of the monument, and a special service was held in a local church, honoring Munslow and his weird pagan practice. It did generate more publicity for the legend, though. Anyway, and now for something completely different.
In this Hampshire village in the year 1150, the curse of the Tichbornes began. On her deathbed, Lady Mabel Tichborne told her family that unless each year on that day they give the villagers 1 gallon of flour, the house of Tichborne would crumble away. To this day, a Latin benediction marks the ceremony. In country life and tradition, curses have a longer history than rationing.
The curse described is associated with the Tichborne dole, that is, the doling out of all that flour. It's said the curse was fulfilled after a brief suspension in the practice in the late 1700s, which was followed by the crumbling of a corner of the Tichborne house in 1803 and a failure thereafter to produce male heirs. A satisfying story, but it's the dole itself, or doles generally, that's related to our topic. Before dole came to mean government handouts in the early 20th century, it referred to donations from individual estates, either of money or things like bread and ale, given to the poor immediately following an individual's death, the funeral dole, as it was called. Or, more rarely, it could be an ongoing annual distribution written into a will, as with Lady Tichborne. All of this is relevant because of something Aubrey appended to his account of sin eating, namely,
methinks doles to poor people with money at funerals have some resemblance to that of the sin eater. Doles at funerals were continued at gentlemen's funerals in the west of England till the Civil War.
The reference to the Civil War is significant as it resulted in Cromwell's Puritans largely rooting out any lingering traces of Britain's Catholic culture, which included the funeral dole. In our newsreel clip, the reference to Latin rites is a reminder of the dole's Catholic nature.
A Latin benediction marks the ceremony.
While for Protestants, the course of the soul's journey to heaven or hell is fixed by the time of death, the matter is more flexible under the Catholic doctrine of purgatory, that is, the stage of the afterlife during which the soul is purified before its ascent heavenward. Therefore, the purpose of many of the older funeral customs was the shortening of the deceased's time in purgatory, which is generally not considered a pleasant place. Charitable doles could work towards this end, and implicit in the giving was an understanding that the recipient would offer prayers for the deceased in return for the doled-out items to quicken that ascent. For this reason, it's been suggested that practices like sin eating represent either a garbled memory of former Catholic funeral customs or an actual folk ritual preserving certain elements of these. Given all this, it's worth noting that none of our reports of sin eating are associated with Ireland, where Catholic ritual was still intact and ungarbled. Funeral feasts were another ancient custom rewarding those attending the ceremony. In the days before hearses, when transport of the body to the churchyard was the responsibility of the family, these feasts served to reward those who assisted with the heavy lifting, so to speak. It would not only be family and friends called to assist, especially if the road to the grave was very long, then more remote acquaintances might be recruited, or even strangers who might be more interested in free food and especially drink. Such questionable recruits are commented on in the 1867 book Lancashire Folklore by Thomas Turner and John Hartland, no relation to the author of the folklore article. It mentions rural funerals sometimes becoming
a matter of sad notoriety. Indeed, it was not very unusual to see those who were to convey the dead to the sepulchre, tottering from intoxication under their sad burden.
It's possible that elements of the Sin Eater legends were, in part, inspired by the transactional aspects of the funeral feast and the unsavory characters, the outsiders allowed into the family circle to perform a necessary evil. In some cases, funeral feasts could also bear resemblance to funeral doles, as with what was called the arvel, a word and custom rooted in Norse culture transmitted to Scotland and the north of England. The arvel meal held after the burial was also known as an inheritance feast and was the occasion to make public the will of the deceased and distribute their goods. And later still, arvel became a type of round spiced cake or cookie served to funeral guests. The arvel cake was just a local name for funeral biscuits or funeral cookies in American, which were part of traditional send-offs from the 18th century into the Victorian era.
These are the best cookies I've ever eaten.
These cookies were particularly common in the north of England, but could be found throughout and also in early America. An article from a 1709 edition of the periodical Gentleman's Magazine described them as
a kind of sugared biscuit, which are wrapped up, generally two of them together, in a sheet of wax paper, sealed with black wax.
Funeral cookies might be distributed in one of several ways. They could be sent to individuals' homes before the funeral as an announcement of the death and invitation to the funeral, or they could be given out during the wake or sent to those unable to attend the rites. The recipe and form of the funeral biscuit varied. A kind of shortbread was often used, usually flavored with caraway and stamped with the impression of some image associated with death. When they made their way to the American colonies, they were stamped with designs like those on Puritan gravestones, winged heads representing the soul, hourglass, or skull. By the late 1800s, ladyfingers, the sponge cake cookie, also known as Savoy biscuits or Naples biscuits, had become a popular form of the funeral cookie. By this time, the custom, which was never as strong in America, had died out there, and the ladyfinger trend was unknown, as noted in an 1897 article appearing in the New York Times.
The American fashion of serving ladyfingers at afternoon tea is said to be a source of some surprise to English people, for the little cakes are generally known in England as funeral biscuits.
In rural areas, the custom remained stronger and families baked their own funeral cookies, but by the 1800s, they could also be ordered from bakeries. This was preferred in the cities and by the upper classes. Serving ladyfingers rather than the round cakes also signified a higher status. Whatever their form, the cookies would come packaged, folded in black bordered paper, is generally used for death notices, and printed with a suitable verse. An example from 1882, preserved in London's Pitt Rivers Museum, used these words from a hymn.
Thee we adore, eternal name, and humbly own to thee. How feeble is our mortal frame, what dying worms we be.
The text goes on, but I'll leave it there at the image of worms wriggling in a rotting corpse, just the thing for a food wrapper. Oh, and the funeral cookies also played a role in the tradition of telling the bees, which was discussed, I believe, in our bees episode. An 1838 article from the Leeds-based newspaper Northern Star says,
At all weddings and funerals, they give a piece of the wedding cake or funeral biscuit to the bees, informing them at the same time of the name of the party, married or dead. If the bees do not know of the former, they become very irate and sting. Oh. That does sound like the bees.
I thought you'd like that. Finally, let's consider a 1911 entry on sin eating in the Encyclopedia Britannica. It describes an 1893 Shropshire funeral at which
a woman poured out a glass of wine for each bearer and handed it to him across the coffin with a funeral biscuit. The burial cakes, which are still made in parts of rural England, for example, Lincolnshire and Cumberland, are almost certainly a relic of sin eating.
Certainly, or possibly the other way around. That is, that the figure of the sin eater is a bit of folklore which was inspired by the appearance of strangers, perhaps very strange or undesirable strangers, showing up to render services at funerals. Hauling the body to the grave, however, isn't really a matter of saving or cleansing the soul. But what if we mixed in memories of those saving prayers expected in exchange for feeding the funeral guests? And then these funeral biscuits we've been discussing, are they really very different in function from soul cakes? You may have heard of these in connection with Halloween. In Britain, they were given out to children circulating through towns on All Souls' Day, begging for soul cakes with songs like this.
A soul cake, please, good missus, a soul cake. Apple, a pear, a plum, or a cherry, any good thing to make us merry. One for Peter, two for Paul.
The sweets were given out with the understanding, again, that in exchange, the singers would pray for the family's dead, which in the original Catholic understanding would mean praying for the soul's ascent from purgatory. But the practice of souling was maintained also by Protestants, because these customs just die hard, just like the headstones carved with "Rest in Peace" long after we feared the restless dead rising from their graves to wander earthbound in another form of purgatorial imprisonment.
I drink to the peace of him that's gone.
Raising a glass, eating a cookie, eating bread and salt, they were all actions intended to free the soul, in a sense, to see it off to a restful, joyful eternity. So was the folklore of sin eaters just a fanciful embodiment of all these ideas? Or in remote times and remote regions were there actually at least a few who really did serve as sin eaters, as described?
Is there a sin eater?
I really don't know. I certainly wouldn't want to do it.
we wish you 10 times more.